My name is Vijay. Just call me Vijay. That's a really long name. I've been working on the ecology and evolution of influenza for nearly 20 years. I've been trained at Hong Kong U School of Public Health. I used to work in avian influenza for a long time, but now I work with all sorts of respiratory viruses. I try to understand how viruses spread and what is the diversity of viruses and how to control them. So that's really my work. And I do a lot of genomics. So we get the viruses in. If you're traveling abroad, you get a sneeze, we get the samples in, we sequence the genomes, and then we perform a series of computational analyses methods to try and understand and elucidate the dynamics of influenza, infectious pathogens. There you go. Thank you. I just want to do my acknowledgements first. I was working in Hong Kong U as a postdoc, but then I moved to Singapore for some years. I was working in Duke NUS right in this city for nearly 6 years. And then I moved to Monash University in Australia, Melbourne for a few years. And now I went back to Hong Kong U School of Public Health during COVID, because I think Hong Kong U is one of the best places to study infectious diseases, and there's something happening there all the time. That's my team, and they've done a lot of work for the presentation I'm going to give today. I've also collaborated heavily with Ian Barr in the WHO center in Melbourne, and I need to acknowledge that person. And I also saw David a bit earlier, so I just want to say hello to David from Perth a bit later. All right, so influenza, the previous speaker presented a series of, initially presented a series of table where he showed some outbreaks happening in big years. And I just wanted to highlight that these outbreaks are kind of the things that people recognize, because lots of people are admitted into hospitals. But seasonal influenza is an annual event. It happens all the time. It happens every year. It is basically dependent on lots of reasons in terms of geography. For one of the reasons is the plot on the right, that on the top that you see is, it's basically different regions, and the red color highlights the time when these outbreaks are occurring. So if you go to the northern hemisphere, you can see the outbreaks occurring in November, December, January, February months. Whereas in the tropical regions, we can't really tell when it's happening. But then if you go to the southern hemisphere, it's happening in their winter months, in April, June, July, and so forth. So it's really patterns depending on the seasonality of the virus. Tropical and subtropical regions can sustain the viruses for a really long time, because there's lots of people in the tropics and subtropics, and regions such as Southeast Asia can actually has high density of population, lots of interconnected cities, and these regions can maintain viruses a really long time. But then if you have huge outbreaks in the northern hemisphere or the southern hemisphere, depending on whether these viruses evolved, antigenic drift and things like that, then the tropics and subtropics have a feedback from these other regions, because there's a huge outbreaks happening in some other region, and they feed these viruses back into tropics and subtropics. We also think that, but we don't know really well yet, that because these viruses are maintained throughout the year in the tropics and subtropics, we think that that's where the virus is evolving, right? So the virus is evolving, it's escaping antigenic drift, and it's evolving further. And then and then in the northern and the southern hemispheres, these viruses only sustain for 3 or 4 months. So we don't really think that the virus is evolving as much. Let me go back for a bit. We also think that the viruses also don't sustain in any region, right? It's rapidly migrating. It's unlike most other endemic diseases and things like that, where you really have to have viruses being continually introduced into your region to maintain some epidemic. So it's not like it is not like as if one virus enters and causes an outbreak. There's a repeated introduction of the viruses. And we all travel. So as you go in the airport, there's like people traveling everywhere. And that's how these influenza epidemics are maintained. It's unlike most other viruses that we know of. But then everything changed when COVID-19 happened. And so that plot, that line there, indicates the start of the pandemic in 2020. And as you can see that there's lots of epidemics happening. This is just a map of different cities in the US. And then once the pandemic started, influenza just collapsed. And as I explained previous slide, influenza is maintained because people's movement, because of migration. And when the pandemic started, really the whole influenza circulation just collapsed globally, because there's lots of control measures that we implemented. And that's the first time we realized that actually non-pharmaceutical interventions can actually have a huge impact in terms of influenza migration. And so these are just some plots showing the collapse of influenza in different regions. But the same thing happened to RSV as well. There was a collapse. But we do know that RSV remains endemic in many cities. And so as soon as people started opening up, for example, Australia contained the virus really well the first year. We were seeing huge RSV outbreaks in hospitals, in care centers for children and things like that. So RSV kind of remains endemic, whereas influenza epidemics actually completely change because these viruses need to come back and cause these epidemics. Well, I just wanted to give a brief one slide about the methodology that we use. I kind of study phylogenetics, which is trying to understand evolution of these viruses. It has played a huge role during the COVID-19 pandemic, as we know that everybody sequences the virus now. Everybody knows about what variants are circulating. So once we know these genomes, we can actually use these methodologies to track whether, the cases are travel or imported. Is there an outbreak happening in certain situations because of a single introduction? We can identify the phenotypes like variants, Omicron, BA2, whatever. We can understand reinfections or chronic infections. So we can do a lot of things just by understanding genomics. But modern methodologies also allow us to estimate things that are really important for public health measures, such as estimate effective population sizes and things like that. So we can do a lot of things based on just the sequences that we collect from viruses. We don't have to know much of the other information. Much of my talk is going to be on this paper. It's available online, Nature Communications. Just to give you a brief overview of influenza viruses before I go deeper into influenza viruses. Influenza viruses cause huge pandemics, right? We've known the 1918 pandemic, the 1957 pandemic, the 1968 pandemic, and the 2009 pandemic. And these viruses have emerged from animals, jumped into humans, and then caused a huge pandemic for 1, 2, or 3 years. And then they establish in humans and continue to circulate to cause seasonal influenza. So everything starts with the pandemic, and then they continue to circulate. Currently, we have, there you go. So presently, we used to have a quadrivalent vaccine, which was targeting against H1N1 virus, against the H3N2 virus. The Victoria B virus is actually, the B viruses diverged into 2 lineages called the Victoria and Yamagata, and they continue to circulate. So before the pandemic, we kind of had 4 different lineages. I just want to start right away that this one, the Yamagata virus, has not been detected since the pandemic. So we think that that virus has been extinct because of human measures, what we did to control COVID-19, really. So, we really want to understand what really happened to influenza. So the first thing we did was try to look at case data. We have a very good global influenza surveillance system, which has been going for many, many years. More than 150 countries participate, and they submit data to the WHO. And so we first started to analyze what really happened towards these outbreaks. Before COVID, as you can see here, there's about 40,000 or 50,000 cases reported annually in the Northern Hemisphere. And there's about 2,000 cases reported from the Southern Hemisphere countries before the pandemic. But once the beginning of the pandemic, there's almost very few cases were reported. And we don't think that was because of less focus on influenza, because this line represents the number of samples that were tested for influenza. Initially, it did take a beating because of people were focusing on COVID, but actually the testing for influenza increased even further than before the COVID pandemic, during the COVID pandemic. So there was not like as if people were not looking. Lots of people were looking for these viruses. They were just weren't there. So this plot shows you the actual numbers on the right. So just dramatic losses, less than 500 cases in the Northern Hemisphere. And I just want to point out this, most of these viruses were reported from China. And most of these viruses were B Victoria viruses, which the B Victoria lineage of the viruses were the mostly direct viruses. And as you know that the first 2-3 years, China was COVID-free and people were free to move. So we know that There was no introduction into China, but these viruses continue to circulate. I'll talk a bit about B. Victoria in the end. But the most dramatic thing was the fall in cases in the southern hemisphere, where the number of cases were just less than a dozen in most of the weeks that were reported for the first 2 years of the pandemic. That this is just dramatic in terms of influenza cases anywhere that can occur. Next, we looked at the genetics of these viruses. The first thing we do is we try to name everything, right? Like BA2, Omicron, and everything. We don't have such an advanced system for influenza, so we have stupid names such as A1, B1, and things like that. People, think of influenza as evolving really quickly, and we have to update the vaccines annually, right? And we think that the evolution is so fast that it escapes immunity, and then it's like a bottleneck. Every 2 or 3 years, there's a bottleneck. One virus strain, one person, again, that infected person, the virus evolves, and it kind of takes over everything. So there's repeated taking over. So for example, just to compare COVID again, we had the Alpha, Beta, Delta, and then Omicron emerged, and it took over everything, right? However, since 2009, since the H1N1 pandemic, that hasn't really happened for influenza, and we don't really understand that really well. But H1N1 emerged to cause a huge pandemic, and since then, these viruses have been diversifying. They've not been there's not been bottlenecks of repeated variants emerging. They've actually been diversifying. So before the pandemic, we had these multiple different clades of the four different viruses. And as you can see here, there's a huge bottleneck, and the number of lineages that we detected reduced significantly since the start of the pandemic. Moving further, so this is how a phylogenetic tree looks. So this is basically showing you relationships of different strains of these 4 different viruses. Absolutely no Yamagata, but we can see that as these viruses have diverged, and before the pandemic, we had viruses circulating which diverged on even before the 2009 viruses co-circulating. But we found that many of them ceased to circulate, some of them, but there were like only 1 or 2 pockets of viruses from each of these viruses continuing to circulate. Moving further, we wanted to understand how the global movement and ceasing of global movement has affected influenza viruses. As you can see on the left side maps, the colors are all mixed up. So as these viruses and clades are circulating everywhere. But since the pandemic, you can see that the geographical distribution of the viruses has changed. So the first time ever, I think, for influenza, we see that there's a geographic separation of these viruses, which has never happened before. It's always mixed together. And we can also see that there's certain regions in the world which are actually harboring these viruses. People have already identified Southeast Asia, Southern Asia as important regions of these viruses to harbor. But we found that West Africa played a huge role in maintaining several of these lineages during the COVID pandemic for all the viruses. West Africa was a huge region maintaining these viruses, and many of these viruses that we see here circulating was actually quite maintained in West Africa. Going further, we also found that many of these lineages, so these are lines just showing the circulation of each of these lineages over time since the beginning of the pandemic. And as you can see here, that the number of lineages actually reduced dramatically. However, we also found that there were some lineages which are not being detected for a really long time, and then suddenly detected after like 2 or 3 years, which again also highlights us that some gaps in influenza surveillance that we still need to fill. And we don't know exactly where these viruses have been circulating for such a long time, but still circulating. So just summarizing my results so far, subtropical regions in West Africa, South and South Asia can sustain influenza for long periods without global movement of these viruses. There was lots of differences in terms of COVID-19 control policies, which we were not able to really elucidate what was going on. We also predicted that the continued evolution of distant lineages can actually increase the risk of trying to select which vaccine, which strain we should pick for a vaccine. And we also predicted that because of the lack of circulation of influenza, we do have an immunity gap in the population, which can affect the future evolution of these viruses. Looking at these updated stream graphs again since the pandemic, we haven't really seen regular circulation of influenza yet, I think, because even though we've in a post-pandemic era, the control measures and people's behaviors have completely changed towards influenza, especially in Asia. And we still haven't seen regular influenza seasons so far. I just want to touch upon what happened in China, because China was COVID-free for 3 years, and it was completely controlled, and people were easy to move around the country. And we were to better understand, using this data, to understand what's really going on about influenza. For the first thing we found out was it was all influenza B viruses that were being maintained. There was only one lineage. It was completely contained. There was virus circulation, and people were free to move. So what some of the highlights was we were able to identify what regions in the mainland actually contribute to other regions of influenza, because the whole country was closed from external introduction. And we did, our analyses did point out Jiangxi as one of the central regions which harbors these viruses for a really long time and contribute to outbreaks everywhere else. And just about Jiangxi is one of the less richer provinces in the mainland, and lots of people travel from Jiangxi to other places. And so we saw that these viruses can actually be maintained in Jiangxi for a long time and then spread around the country during this period. We also found that the virus's outbreaks were dependent on when people were actually moving about. As we know that, we think about seasonality as a major factor, something like, something weather and things like that. But we should also think about seasonality is actually influenced by people's mobility. We change our behaviors when it gets cold. We travel more. There's lots more holidays in the winter months. And as you can see here, we are actually tracing the transmission rate of these viruses over time. And these lines indicate the major holidays within the mainland China during this pandemic. And each time we have a huge holiday, there's a huge increase in transmission of these viruses. So people's mobility and things like that actually has a huge role in the transmission of influenza, which we didn't really think about before the COVID-19 pandemic. We always thought it was just seasonality and weather and something happening up in the heavens. All right, so let's forget about influenza for a bit, just my last 2 slides. We do have a huge number of viruses which cause respiratory diseases. Obviously, SARS-CoV-2 is probably the top at the moment, followed by influenza, RSV, other seasonal coronaviruses, and many other viruses. And this is just a map from the Seattle Flu Alliance, because they have a very good surveillance system in the region classifying what different viruses, respiratory viruses, circulating. And one of the things I want to point out was many things changed since the pandemic. Many things collapsed. But one thing that really didn't change was the blue. And the blue is the rhinoviruses. Rhinoviruses are common cold viruses. They don't really do much to us. They're everywhere. They have a huge diversity, and they transmit all the time. So we want to take this opportunity to understand what's going on with rhinoviruses, which nobody's interested in. And we can see that rhinoviruses, so apart from all these viruses, this is in Hong Kong between 2 years, and these are all the respiratory viruses that were detected in Hong Kong. We had an extra high surveillance system. Anybody who gets any sneeze gets taken into a doctor and then gets tested what's going on. So we had a really good surveillance system. And we did find that most of these were still rhinoviruses, and things that every time there's like a school opening, every time there's like children meet together, there was always a rhinovirus outbreak. Moving further, but we did try to understand the genetics of these viruses. However, we couldn't do much because these are the red dots, are the clusters of these viruses. So we clearly know that these clusters and outbreaks are occurring, and we could trace these clusters. But there's no other data from elsewhere. We could only find these few countries which actually sequence the rhinovirus genomes to understand these viruses. So we couldn't really tell much in terms of how these viruses are circulating. Well, that's the end of my talk.
a couple of questions online, or we can take them from the audience here. But one was, you mentioned that we got a funny naming system. Do people care if it's from China? Does that make a difference, or do people actually care where it's named? And do you have a better naming system rather than the exciting one we've got?
Good question. I mean, we used to call things after places before. We don't do that anymore. And that's why we have that silly naming system. I'd rather prefer using names of places, but obviously there's lots of problems in doing that. We don't have a good system at all because taxonomy and classification is always problematic in terms of how people name things. We should probably go back to Latin.
Or Greek, Omega or Omicron. Hang on, I'll have to just interpret this next question before I... Okay, I think the thrust of the question is, we often talk about influenza-like illnesses, and you did allude to the fact there's always a cold or something like that. Because we're getting vaccines, new vaccines, it matters whether it's COVID, whether it's flu, whether it's rhinovirus, or maybe whooping cough or something else. Should we stop talking about influenza-like illnesses and start to talk about respiratory illnesses, upper respiratory infections, acute respiratory illness? Do you have sort of something that we should rethink how we talk and classify and investigate when someone presents with a influenza-like illness?
It's a good question again. I mean, I think the capacity for different countries to try and classify diseases, I'm not a clinician though, having said that, has changed over time. So previously, people look at people's symptoms and that's how things were classified. If our technologies become better and it becomes globally available where people can type these viruses, and I think only then we can start telling people in terms of you've got an RSV and things like that. But unless then, we have no choice but to stick with symptoms. And influenza-like illness is kind of a broad term for upper respiratory diseases, and I think it still is valid. It also highlights the importance of influenza being one of the major respiratory diseases. I mean, obviously, we've had COVID pandemic, but going forward, I don't really think COVID's going to be the big thing. It's going to be influenza again, because these things evolve really quickly. They make us sick quite badly. Some of these ones, like H3N2 viruses, actually infects all age groups. It doesn't, just infect children and you get immunity. So you actually evolves and continues to infect people. So I think influenza-like illness is a good name for these diseases.
Cool, thank you. We got a couple of questions here on the floor.
Yeah, Paul Tambaya from Singapore. Nice talk. So 2 questions. First off, the question about the rhinovirus. We saw exactly the same thing, where rhinovirus didn't change despite all the social distancing and the mask use. And one theory was that it's because the mode of transmission of rhinovirus is different, and that you've got more fecal-oral transmission of rhinovirus rather than respiratory. And the second, so I'd be interested in your thoughts on that. And then the second question is about RSV. So what we found, and I think they found the same in Australia, was that RSV came back a lot before influenza came back. Any thoughts as to why?
Yeah, I think related again, right? I think it's about the levels of endemicity that these viruses can sustain. Our data clearly shows that endemic circulation of influenza is really not feasible, right? If there's a virus circulating in your community, it just dissipates really quickly. So you have to have repeated introduction of the viruses to sustain influenza epidemics. And there's lots of factors causing that. Whereas I do think that rhinoviruses as well as RSV can maintain in some populations, I think especially very young children or nursery schools or, things like that. And I also think that maybe RSV and rhinoviruses can actually do cause longer infections as well in some children, that they can actually be infected for weeks or even months, and then just continually shedding these viruses. It's only very recently the chronic infection of an acute infection is being understood based on COVID. Only now we're trying to gather understanding that these viruses can actually sustain in some individuals and accumulate mutations over time and then emerge again. It's only now we're really starting to realize that. But the proportion of these population might be small. But based on this data, it's really clear that RSV is definitely can be endemic in some regions and then cause these outbreaks. And working with David, he's got amazing data from Western Australia. And we're just seeing that these viruses can sustain for a really long time, really, without any global interaction. That's my answer.
one very last question, and keep the questions coming online because that gives us an opportunity to answer them when we finish the meeting. So last question and quickly. Yeah.
Thank you. Hi, Vijay.
Hello.
Nice meeting you again in Singapore. So my question here is that you demonstrated that there is actually selections of some of the fetus influenza virus. And my question here is, does these particular strains now is actually quite homogeneous in certain regions? What is the relations in terms of clinical severity outcome? And of course, is the predictions in the future, whether the future evolutions of the influenza viruses will basically follow the lineages, and what kind of hope we have in the future? Thank you.
It's just a really tough question, really. I mean, I really think that the severity of influenza doesn't change over time, really, seasonality. We know that the H3N2 virus is probably more severe just because it just infects more people. It causes 80% of the infections, whereas the other three don't really cause as many infections, except just for a few years, like H1N1 causes these outbreaks. But H3N2 virus is really the biggest killer in terms of humans. And I don't think the severity has changed over time. However, the evolution of these viruses can slow or become faster over time. And H3N2 sort of, it used to antigenically evolve based on human immunity. And our immunity is what determines the evolution because they have to escape it and that's what drives it. But we've changed it for the past 3 years. And so I don't know how to, in the future, what to predict and which strain become more advantageous. So now, for the first time, really, what we're seeing is maybe the viruses are evolving not just because of human immunity, but all of our control measures and things like that. So I don't really have an answer for you. I'm so sorry.